In the summer of 1906, a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler arrived at a remote hilltop in central Turkey, roughly 150 kilometers east of the modern capital Ankara. He had been drawn there by rumors of ancient tablets, clay fragments covered in strange cuneiform, writing that local villagers had been digging up for years and selling to antiquities dealers. What Winkler found when he began to excavate was not a few scattered tablets. It was an archive, more than 10,000 clay tablets, inscribed in a language no living scholar could read, buried beneath the rubble of massive stone walls that stretched for kilometers across the barren Anatolian plateau. The walls enclosed an area of roughly 180 hectares. They were punctuated by monumental gateways, flanked by carved stone lions and sphinxes. Behind the walls lay the foundations of temples, palaces, granaries, and administrative buildings, the skeleton of a city that had once been the capital of an empire. The empire was the Hittite Empire, the city was Hattusa, and until Winkler's discovery, the modern world had almost entirely forgotten that either had existed. Think about that for a moment. An empire that had controlled most of modern Turkey, that had ruled over millions of people, that had conquered northern Syria, that had fought the Egypt of Ramesses II to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in roughly 1274 before the Common Era, that had signed the oldest known international peace treaty in human history, that had corresponded as an equal with the pharaohs and the kings of Babylon, that had maintained a sophisticated legal system and a multilingual bureaucracy, had been so thoroughly erased from human memory that by the 19th century its very existence was disputed. A few references in the Hebrew Bible mentioned a people called the Hittites, but most scholars assumed they were a minor local tribe, not the rulers of a great empire. Egyptian inscriptions referred to the land of Hatti as a major power, but without corroborating evidence, the references was difficult to interpret. The Hittites were a footnote, a question mark, a name without a face. And then Winkler dug into that hilltop, and the footnote became a civilization. The question mark became an empire. The tablets he unearthed, once deciphered, revealed a world of astonishing complexity. International diplomacy, royal marriages between rival dynasties, elaborate religious ceremonies invoking 1,000 gods, legal codes, protecting the rights of slaves and regulating the price of livestock, letters from queens pleading for military aid, and treaties carved in silver and sent between great kings. Hattusa was not merely a city. It was the administrative heart of one of the great powers of the ancient world, a city that had stood for centuries as the seat of an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Euphrates River, and the world had forgotten it completely. For nearly 3,000 years, no one knew it was there. The stones of the city walls were scavenged by local villagers for their own building projects. The carved lions at the gates were half buried in centuries of accumulated earth, their snarling faces staring blindly into the soil. The tablets lay in the dirt, their messages unread, their languages unknown, their authors unnamed. A city of tens of thousands, the capital of an empire of millions, erased from human consciousness as thoroughly as if it had never existed. How is this possible? How does an empire vanish so completely that not even the memory of its existence survives? We know the names of Egyptian pharaohs stretching back 5,000 years. We know the kings of Babylon and Assyria. We know the heroes of Mycenaean Greece, or at least the legends that grew around them. But the Hittites, who stood as equals among these civilizations, who exchanged letters and gifts and brides with the pharaohs and the Babylonian kings, who fought one of the most famous battles in ancient history, were simply forgotten. Their language died. Their writing system fell out of use, their cities crumbled, their archives were buried, and the world moved on, utterly unaware of the gap in its memory, utterly unconscious of the civilization-sized hole in the historical record. The rediscovery of the Hittites is itself a remarkable story of archaeological detective work. Before Winkler's excavations, scattered clues had been accumulating for decades. In the 1870s and 80s, European travelers and scholars had noticed inscriptions in an unknown hieroglyphic script carved on stones at various sites across Turkey and northern Syria. These Hittite hieroglyphics, as they came to be called, were clearly distinct from Egyptian hieroglyphics and from Mesopotamian cuneiform. They suggested the existence of a literate civilization that did not correspond to any known ancient culture. At the same time, the Amarna letters found in Egypt in 1887 included correspondence from the king of a land called Hatti, written in cuneiform on clay tablets. These letters were addressed to the pharaoh as between equals, suggesting that Hatti was a major power. But where was Hatti? Who were its people? What had happened to them? The answer came from Boghaz-Kale. Winkler's discovery of the cuneiform archive proved that the biblical Hittites and the Hatti of the Egyptian records were one and the same, and that they had been the rulers of one of the great empires of the Bronze Age world. The decipherment of Hittite, accomplished primarily by the Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný in 1915, revealed that the Hittite language was Indo-European, related to Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, making it the oldest known written Indo-European language. This was itself a revelation, transforming our understanding of the distribution and history of the Indo-European language family. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand how the Hittite Empire rose, what made Hattusa one of the great cities of the Bronze Age world, why the entire civilization collapsed in a single catastrophic generation, and what its disappearance tells us about the fragility of human memory and the terrifying ease with which the greatest achievements of a civilization can be swallowed by time. You are going to walk through the gates of a city that was lost for 3 millennia and see what the ancient world looked like at its most interconnected, its most sophisticated, and its most vulnerable. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin. To understand what was lost when Hattusa fell, we first need to understand what the Hittite Empire was and what made it extraordinary, because this was not a minor kingdom clinging to the margins of the ancient world. This was one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, a period stretching from roughly 1500 to 1200 before the Common Era, when the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East were linked together in a web of trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence that has been called, without exaggeration, the First Age of Globalization. The story of the Hittites begins long before the empire. Sometime during the early second millennium before the Common Era, a people speaking an Indo-European language migrated into or emerged within the highlands of central Anatolia, the vast plateau that forms the interior of modern Turkey. These highlands were harsh country, dry in summer, bitterly cold in winter, swept by winds that could strip the soil from the fields and pile snow meters deep in the mountain passes. But they were also rich in resources: copper, silver, iron, timber, grain, and livestock. The people who settled there were tough, adaptable, and, as it turned out, exceptionally talented at both warfare and diplomacy. The Hittites established their capital at a place they called Hattusa, on a rocky promontory overlooking a deep gorge near the modern Turkish village of Boghaz-Kale. The site was strategically chosen. The gorge provided natural defense on one side. The surrounding terrain was rugged and difficult to approach. Springs provided water, and the location was central enough to command the trade routes that crossed Anatolia, linking the Aegean coast to the west, with Mesopotamia to the southeast. The earliest settlement at the site predates the Hittites themselves. An earlier people, the Hatti, had lived there before being absorbed or displaced by the Hittite newcomers. The Hittites took the name of the land, Hatti, as their own, a pattern of cultural absorption that would characterize their civilization throughout its history. The Hittite state grew slowly at first, consolidating control over the central Anatolian plateau through a combination of warfare, diplomacy, and strategic marriage alliances with local rulers. The Old Kingdom period, from roughly 1650 to 1500 before the Common Era, saw the establishment of the basic institutions of Hittite governance: a king who served as supreme military commander, chief priest, and chief judge, a royal court staffed by relatives and trusted subordinates, a system of provincial governors who administered conquered territories, and a sophisticated legal code that regulated everything from murder and theft to the terms of land tenure, the wages of hired labourers, and the penalties for allowing a pig to root in someone else's grain field. The legal code is worth pausing over because it reveals a great deal about the character of Hittite civilization. Unlike the famous Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, which prescribed harsh physical punishments including death, mutilation, and drowning for many offences, the Hittite laws emphasized compensation and restitution. A murderer was required to compensate the victim's family with a payment of persons, essentially providing replacement laborers or household members. Theft was punished by repayment of multiple times the value of the stolen goods. Even serious offences, like arson, could be settled by monetary compensation rather than physical punishment. The Hittite legal system was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably pragmatic and relatively humane. It was concerned less with vengeance than with restoring social equilibrium, repairing the damage done rather than inflicting suffering on the offender. The empire reached its peak during the New Kingdom period, from roughly 1400 to 1200 before the Common Era, under a series of aggressive and capable kings, including Suppiluliuma I, Mursili II, Muwatalli II, and Hattusili III. The Hittite Empire expanded to control a vast territory stretching from the Aegean coast of western Turkey to the upper Euphrates River in what is now southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. At its maximum extent, the empire encompassed an area of roughly 1 million square kilometers, making it comparable in size to the modern nations of France and Germany combined. It encompassed dozens of distinct peoples, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, and following different customs, all held together by the administrative apparatus centered on Hattusa. The city itself grew accordingly. During the New Kingdom period, Hattusa underwent a massive expansion. The original settlement on the rocky promontory, now called the Lower City, was augmented by a vast upper city to the south, enclosed by a new circuit of fortification walls that extended the city's perimeter to over 6 kilometers. The total enclosed area grew to roughly 180 hectares, making Hattusa one of the largest cities in the ancient Near East, comparable in size to the great Mesopotamian cities of Babylon and Ashur. Within those walls, the Hittites built more than 30 temples, including the Great Temple in the Lower City, a massive complex covering over 14,000 square meters, with its own granaries, workshops, and administrative offices. The Upper City contained additional temples, each dedicated to different deities drawn from the diverse populations of the empire, as well as royal residences, military barracks, and storage facilities capable of holding grain reserves sufficient to feed the city through prolonged sieges. The fortification walls themselves were engineering marvels. They were built using a technique called casemate construction, in which two parallel walls were connected by cross walls, creating a series of internal chambers that could be used for storage, barracks, or filled with rubble for additional strength. At their base, the walls were roughly 8 meters thick, presenting a formidable obstacle to any attacking force. They were built on foundations of massive stone blocks, carefully fitted without mortar, with the upper portions constructed of mud brick reinforced with timber beams, and they were punctuated by projecting rectangular towers at regular intervals that allowed defenders to direct flanking fire against attackers who had reached the base of the wall. The southern section of the fortifications, protecting the upper city, was built along a great artificial earthen rampart that raised the wall line even higher above the surrounding terrain, creating a defensive position of extraordinary strength. The gates were the most impressive features of the fortifications. Monumental arched entrances flanked by carved stone figures, including the famous Lion Gate, where two massive stone lions snarled outward at approaching visitors with a ferocity that still feels palpable after more than 3,000 years, and the King's Gate, where a relief carving of a warrior god, nearly 2 meters tall, stood guard over the entrance, his muscles tensed, his weapon raised, projecting an image of divine power protecting the city. A third gate, the Sphinx Gate in the southern wall, was flanked by carved sphinxes, figures combining human heads with lion bodies, showing the artistic influence of both Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions. A unique feature of Hattusa's defences was a postern tunnel, a corbel-arched passageway that ran beneath the city wall at one point, emerging outside the fortifications through a concealed exit. This tunnel, roughly 70 meters long, was built with remarkable engineering precision, its walls converging gradually overhead to form a pointed arch using the corbeling technique. It may have been used for surprise sorties during sieges, allowing small groups of soldiers to emerge behind enemy lines, or it may have served ritual purposes connected to the city's religious life, perhaps as a ceremonial passage symbolizing the boundary between the city's sacred interior and the profane world beyond its walls. Let us put the scale of Hattusa into perspective. The city covered roughly 180 hectares. For comparison, the walled city of Troy, one of the most famous cities of the Bronze Age world, enclosed only about 23 hectares. Mycenae, the seat of Agamemnon in Greek legend, covered roughly 30 hectares. Even the great Egyptian capital of Thebes, while extensive, was largely an open city without the massive fortification walls that defined Hattusa. The Hittite capital was, by the standards of its time, enormous. Population estimates vary, but the city may have housed between 20,000 and 50,000 people at its peak, including the royal court, the temple priesthoods, the military garrison, the administrative bureaucracy, and the civilian population of merchants, craftsmen, laborers, and their families. The empire that Hattusa governed was equally impressive in its organization. The Hittites developed a sophisticated system of vassal treaties that bound conquered or allied kingdoms to the Hittite king through sworn oaths, backed by the threat of divine punishment and military intervention. These treaties, preserved in the cuneiform archives at Hattusa, are among the most important documents in the history of international law. They specified the obligations of the vassal king to provide military forces when summoned, to return fugitives, to refrain from independent diplomacy with the Hittite king's enemies, and to pay tribute. In return, the Hittite king guaranteed the vassal's throne, promised military protection against external threats, and sometimes provided economic support. The treaties were witnessed by the gods of both parties, Hittite and vassal, and violations were understood to invite divine wrath. The most famous of all Hittite diplomatic documents is the treaty between Hattusili III and Ramesses II of Egypt, concluded around 1259 before the Common Era, roughly 15 years after the Battle of Kadesh. This treaty, sometimes called the Treaty of Kadesh or the Egyptian-Hittite Peace Treaty, is the oldest known international peace agreement between two sovereign states to survive in a form that can be read. Copies were made in both Hittite cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics, and the treaty addressed mutual non-aggression, mutual defense against third parties, and the extradition of political refugees. It was sealed by a royal marriage. Hattusili sent his daughter to Egypt to marry Ramesses. A copy of the treaty, in its Egyptian version, is displayed today in the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, a reminder that the practice of diplomacy has roots stretching back more than 3,000 years. The Battle of Kadesh, which preceded the peace treaty, deserves attention because it illustrates the scale and sophistication of late Bronze Age warfare. Fought in roughly 1274 before the Common Era near the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River in modern Syria, it was one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. Ramesses II led an Egyptian force of roughly 20,000 soldiers, while the Hittite king Muwatalli II fielded a comparable force, reportedly including 3,500 chariots drawn from the Hittite army and its vassal states. The battle was tactically inconclusive, with both sides claiming victory in their official records. The Egyptian version, carved on temple walls across Egypt, depicts Ramesses heroically fighting his way out of a Hittite ambush. The Hittite version, found in the Hattusa archive, claims a Hittite strategic victory. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Neither side achieved a decisive military advantage, which is precisely why the peace treaty was eventually necessary. Two great powers, equally matched, chose diplomacy over perpetual warfare. It was a pragmatic, civilized decision, and it maintained the peace between Egypt and Hatti for the remaining decades of both empires' existence. The correspondence between the Hittite and Egyptian courts after the peace treaty reveals a relationship that went beyond mere political calculation. The queens of both courts exchanged personal letters. Puduhepa, the powerful queen of Hattusili III, corresponded directly with Ramesses and with the Egyptian queen Nefertari. These letters discuss the arrangements for the royal marriage, the exchange of gifts, and the health and welfare of the royal families. They are written in a tone of personal warmth and mutual respect that is surprisingly modern. Puduhepa was herself a remarkable figure, a Hurrian priestess who married Hattusili when he was still a prince. She wielded enormous political influence throughout his reign, co-signing official documents and corresponding independently with foreign rulers. She is one of the most fully documented women in the ancient world, and her prominence suggests that Hittite society afforded women a higher status than many of its contemporaries. The Hittites were also remarkable for their religious tolerance, or more accurately, their religious inclusiveness. The Hittite state incorporated the gods of every people it conquered into its own pantheon, creating what scholars have called the land of 1,000 gods. The state maintained temples and festivals for deities from Anatolia, Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Hurrian-speaking regions of southeastern Turkey. The king was obligated to perform religious ceremonies for all of these gods, a responsibility so extensive that it occupied a significant portion of the royal calendar. Festival texts from Hattusa describe elaborate multi-day celebrations involving processions, sacrifices, feasting, music, athletic competitions, and ritual performances that were attended by representatives of communities from across the empire. This religious inclusiveness served a political purpose. By honoring the gods of conquered peoples, the Hittite king demonstrated respect for their traditions and reinforced the legitimacy of Hittite rule. It was a remarkably sophisticated approach to imperial governance, one that recognized that political control is more durable when it is accompanied by cultural accommodation rather than cultural suppression. The economy of the Hittite Empire was based primarily on agriculture, supplemented by trade, craft production, and the extraction of mineral resources, particularly metals. The central Anatolian plateau produced wheat, barley, and various fruits and vegetables, though agriculture was always marginal due to the region's relatively low and unpredictable rainfall. Livestock, including cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, were economically important, providing meat, milk, wool, and leather. The Hittite laws contained detailed provisions for the valuation of different types of livestock, suggesting that animals were a significant form of wealth. The empire's mineral wealth was considerable. Central and eastern Anatolia contained deposits of copper, silver, lead, and iron, all of which were exploited by Hittite metalworkers. The production of metalwork, including weapons, tools, ceremonial objects, and jewelry, was a major economic activity, and Hittite bronzework was widely traded and highly regarded. Trade was a critical component of the Hittite economy, linking the empire to the broader Bronze Age commercial network. Hittite merchants exported metals, textiles, and agricultural products and imported luxury goods from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. The trade routes that crossed Anatolia were vital arteries connecting the eastern and western halves of the Bronze Age world, and the Hittites' control of these routes was one of the foundations of their wealth and power. The importance of trade is reflected in the Hittite treaties, which often include provisions for the regulation of commercial activity and the protection of merchants. The math is striking when we consider the civilization's intellectual output. The archive at Hattusa, discovered by Winkler and expanded by subsequent excavations conducted by German teams throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, contains more than 30,000 clay tablets and fragments. These documents are written in at least 8 different languages, including Hittite, which was used for most official and religious texts, Akkadian, which served as the international diplomatic language of the Bronze Age, and was used for correspondence with foreign powers, Sumerian, used in scholarly and religious contexts, Hurrian, the language of the Hurrian-speaking populations of southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, Hattic, the language of the pre-Hittite population of central Anatolia, preserved in religious texts, Luwian, a closely related Indo-European language spoken in western and southern Anatolia, and Palaic, another Anatolian Indo-European language. The multilingual character of the archive is itself evidence of the empire's cosmopolitan character, a state that administered diverse populations speaking different languages and honored religious traditions from multiple cultural backgrounds. The range of subjects covered in the tablets is extraordinary. Royal annals recording military campaigns, diplomatic victories, and natural disasters. Correspondence with foreign kings discussing trade, alliance, and the exchange of royal brides. Religious texts including prayers, hymns, festival descriptions, oracle inquiries, and mythological narratives borrowed from Hurrian, Mesopotamian, and local Anatolian traditions. Legal codes and court proceedings detailing everything from murder investigations to disputes over land boundaries. Medical texts describing symptoms and treatments, instructions for the performance of elaborate state rituals, and administrative records detailing the management of a vast imperial bureaucracy. This archive is, in a very real sense, a window into the world of the Late Bronze Age, providing a level of detail about international relations, religious practice, military organization, and daily life that is unmatched by any other source from the period. The horse training manual deserves special mention because it is one of the most unexpected and remarkable documents in the entire archive, written by a man named Kikuli, who identified himself as a chariot trainer from the Hurrian land of Mitanni. It describes a detailed program for conditioning chariot horses over a period of roughly 214 days. The manual specifies precise intervals of exercise, rest, feeding, watering, and bathing, and it uses technical terms from the Hurrian language alongside Hittite, suggesting that chariot technology and horse training expertise were shared across cultural and linguistic boundaries. Modern equestrians who have studied the Kikuli text have noted that many of its training principles are consistent with modern understanding of equine physiology and conditioning. This single document tells us something profound about the Bronze Age world. It was a world of cross-cultural exchange where specialized knowledge traveled across hundreds of kilometers and between people who spoke different languages, all in the service of a military technology, the chariot, that was central to the power of every major kingdom. Now let us place the Hittite Empire in its broader context, because Hattusa did not exist in isolation. It existed as one node in a network of great powers that together constituted the international system of the Late Bronze Age. This system included Egypt under the New Kingdom pharaohs, Babylonia under the Kassite dynasty, Assyria, rising to power in northern Mesopotamia, Mitanni, the Hurrian-speaking kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia and northern Syria, Mycenaean Greece, which the Hittites called Ahiyawa, and the trading kingdoms of Cyprus, Ugarit, and the Levantine coast. These powers exchanged ambassadors. They wrote letters to one another, addressing each other as brother when they considered themselves equals and as father and son when they did not. They arranged royal marriages to seal alliances. They exchanged lavish gifts of gold, silver, lapis lazuli, ivory, and fine textiles. They traded in copper, tin, grain, wine, oil, perfume, and luxury goods of every description. The Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence found at the Egyptian city of Akhetaten, modern Tel El Amarna, provide an extraordinary window into this world of Bronze Age international relations. These letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets, include messages from the kings of Hatti, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Cyprus, and various Levantine city-states to the pharaoh of Egypt. They discuss trade disputes, military threats, requests for gold, complaints about the quality of diplomatic gifts, arrangements for royal marriages, and the ever-shifting web of alliances and rivalries that characterized relations between the great powers. The letters reveal a world that was, in many ways, recognizably modern in its diplomatic complexity, a world of summits and negotiations, of strategic marriages and broken promises, of proxy wars and balance of power politics. One recurring theme in the Amarna letters is the demand for gold. The king of Babylon writes to the pharaoh, "Gold in your country is like dirt. Just send me as much gold as I need." The Hittite king makes similar requests, though in more diplomatically measured language. These requests reveal the importance of gold as a medium of diplomatic exchange in the Bronze Age world. Gold was not merely a commodity. It was a symbol of royal prestige, a medium of alliance, a material expression of the bonds between great kings, The exchange of gold and other luxury goods between courts was not mere commerce. It was diplomacy conducted through material objects, each gift carrying a message about the giver's wealth, generosity, and commitment to the relationship. The civilization that produced these letters, the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age, was one of the most sophisticated and prosperous in human history up to that point. Trade routes crisscross yet the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, carrying copper from Cyprus, tin from sources as distant as Afghanistan and possibly Cornwall, gold from Egypt and Nubia, lapis lazuli from Central Asia, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa and India, and manufactured goods, textiles, pottery, weapons and jewellery from every major production centre. The wealth generated by this trade supported large urban populations, monumental building programs, extensive military establishments, and complex bureaucratic administrations. It was a golden age, not because it was peaceful. Wars were frequent and often devastating, but because it was connected. The great kingdoms of the Bronze Age were linked together in a web of mutual dependence so intricate that a disruption in one part of the system could send shockwaves through the entire structure. And that is precisely what happened. Around 1200 before the Common Era, within the span of a single generation, the entire system collapsed. The Hittite Empire was destroyed. Hattusa was burned and abandoned. The Mycenaean palace states of Greece fell. Ugarit was sacked and never rebuilt. Egypt was attacked and nearly overwhelmed. The international trade network that had sustained the wealth and complexity of the Bronze Age world shattered into pieces. And the city at the center of one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever known was swallowed by the earth and forgotten for 3,000 years. But what scientists discovered next was worse than anyone expected. The core problem is not simply that Hattusa was destroyed. Cities are destroyed all the time in human history. They burn. They are sacked by enemies. They are abandoned after earthquakes or floods or famines. They are conquered and renamed and absorbed into new political entities. Destruction in the ancient world was commonplace. What makes the destruction of Hattusa so disturbing, so fundamentally unsettling to anyone who studies the ancient world, is not the destruction itself, but the totality of the erasure that followed. The Hittite Empire did not merely collapse as Rome collapsed, leaving behind a rich legacy of language, law, architecture, and cultural memory that shaped everything that came after. It disappeared. It vanished from human consciousness so completely that for 3,000 years no one knew it had existed. Not just the city, not just the government, the entire civilization, its language, its writing, its laws, its gods, its diplomatic traditions, its accumulated knowledge, all of it was lost. And the destruction of Hattusa was not an isolated event. It was part of a catastrophe so vast, so comprehensive, so devastating in its consequences, that historians have given it a name that carries the weight of civilizational extinction: the Bronze Age collapse. To understand the collapse, we need to understand what the world looked like in the decades before it happened. Around 1250 before the Common Era, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East were at the peak of their Bronze Age prosperity. The great powers, Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, Assyria, and the Mycenaean kingdoms were linked by trade, diplomacy, and mutual interest. The peace treaty between Hattusili III and Ramesses II had stabilized the long-contested border between the Hittite and Egyptian spheres of influence in Syria. Trade was flowing, cities were prosperous, the international system was functioning. And then, within roughly 50 years, everything fell apart. The interconnected world that had taken centuries to build, the web of trade and diplomacy and mutual obligation that had linked the great powers in a system of extraordinary prosperity and complexity, disintegrated with a speed that still shocks historians today. The evidence for the collapse comes from multiple sources, but the picture they paint is consistent and terrifying. Beginning around 1200 before the Common Era, a wave of destruction swept across the Eastern Mediterranean. Cities that had stood for centuries were burned and abandoned. Trade networks that had connected distant lands were severed. Kingdoms that had maintained armies and bureaucracies and diplomatic corps were reduced to ruins. The pattern of destruction was not random. It followed the trade routes and the coastlines, moving from east to west, or perhaps from multiple directions simultaneously, like a series of fires converging on a single point. The Hittite Empire was among the first to fall, and in many ways the most completely destroyed. The precise sequence of events leading to its destruction is difficult to reconstruct because the Hittite archives, our primary source of information about the empire's internal affairs, end abruptly around 1200 before the Common Era. The last Hittite king, whose reign can be clearly traced, is Suppiluliuma II, named after the greatest of all Hittite kings, Suppiluliuma I, who had conquered Syria and made the Hittite Empire a superpower 2 centuries earlier. The choice of name may have been intended to invoke past glory in a time of mounting crisis. If so, the invocation did not work. A few fragmentary texts from his reign mention military campaigns against enemies in western Anatolia and naval engagements off the coast of Cyprus. One text found at the site of Ugarit is a letter from the Hittite king to the king of Ugarit requesting an urgent shipment of grain, suggesting that the Hittite heartland was experiencing famine. Another letter, also found at Ugarit, is from a Hittite official to the king of Ugarit, warning that enemy ships have been sighted off the coast and urging defensive preparations, and then silence. After Suppiluliuma II, the records stop. No more royal annals recording the campaigns and achievements of the king. No more diplomatic correspondence between the courts of the great powers. No more treaty texts binding vassal states to their overlord. No more festival descriptions documenting the elaborate religious ceremonies that had honoured 1,000 gods. No more legal proceedings adjudicating the disputes of subjects who had lived under the protection of the Hittite state. The administrative machine that had produced tens of thousands of clay tablets over the course of centuries, documenting every aspect of imperial governance from military strategy to the price of livestock, simply ceased to function. The scribes stopped writing. The archive stopped growing. The bureaucracy that had administered an empire of 1,000,000 square kilometers fell silent. The archive at Hattusa ends not with a final statement, not with a lament for a falling kingdom, not with a prayer for deliverance, not with a cry for help addressed to a distant ally. It ends with a gap, a void, a sudden transition from a functioning state apparatus producing documents at a steady rate to nothing at all. 1 year there are records, the next there are none. The silence is absolute. The archaeological evidence fills in some of the blanks, but the picture it paints is grim. Hattusa shows clear evidence of destruction by fire. The massive fortification walls, which had been designed to withstand siege, were breached. Buildings were burned. The upper levels of the site contain a thick layer of ash and destruction debris. But there is a curious detail that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. The city appears to have been at least partially evacuated before the final destruction. Many of the buildings, including the temples and the royal palace, were found to be largely empty of the portable goods, metal objects, precious stones, and important documents that would normally be expected in a functioning administrative centre. This suggests that the inhabitants had time to remove valuable items before the city fell. Some scholars have interpreted this as evidence that the Hittite court fled Hattusa before the final assault, taking the most important archives and treasures with them. Others have suggested that the city was abandoned gradually over a period of years as conditions deteriorated, with the remaining population finally leaving or being overwhelmed by attackers. A third possibility is that the city was systematically looted after its abandonment, either by the invaders or by local populations picking through the ruins. The question of what happened to the people of Hattusa is one of the most haunting aspects of the story. When the city was destroyed, where did the survivors go? Some may have fled south, toward the regions of southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, where Hittite-related states, sometimes called Neo-Hittite kingdoms, survived for several centuries after the fall of the empire. These small kingdoms, including Carchemish, Aleppo, Hamath, and several others, preserved elements of Hittite culture, language, and writing, using a variant of the Hittite hieroglyphic script. For roughly 500 years after the destruction of Hattusa, they are the lingering echo of the Hittite world, a diminished but recognizable continuation of a once great tradition. But they were small, regional states, not an empire. They had lost the administrative apparatus, the military power, and the international standing of the old Hittite kingdom. And eventually, they too were conquered, first by the Assyrians in the 8th century before the Common Era, and then by the Babylonians and Persians, and the last traces of Hittite civilization were absorbed into the cultures that replaced them. Others who fled Hattusa may have dispersed into the rural population of Anatolia, losing their urban identity and their connection to the Hittite literate tradition within a generation or two. The transition from a literate urban citizen of a great empire to an illiterate farmer in a small village can happen astonishingly quickly when the institutions that sustain literacy, the schools, the scribal workshops, the administrative apparatus that creates demand for written records, disappear. Within a single generation, the skills of reading and writing can be lost if there is no institutional framework to teach and practice them. The children of the last scribes of Hattusa may never have learned to read. Their grandchildren would have had no memory of the skill at all. The cuneiform tradition that had been the intellectual backbone of the Hittite state for centuries would have been extinguished as quietly and completely as a candle in a windstorm. This pattern of rapid literacy loss is well documented in other contexts. When the Mycenaean palaces fell, Linear B vanished within a generation because it was a scribal technology used exclusively by the palace bureaucracy. There was no private literacy, no tradition of personal letter writing, no commercial use of writing outside the palace context. When the palace was gone, the writing went with it. The same dynamic almost certainly applied to the Hittite cuneiform tradition, which was a specialized skill practiced by trained scribes attached to the royal court, the temples, and the provincial administration. Remove those institutions, and the skill had no context in which to survive. But here is the problem. We do not know who destroyed Hattusa. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of the entire Bronze Age collapse. The destruction of multiple major cities across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East within a few decades implies a coordinated or at least widespread force of destruction, but the identity of the destroyers remains unknown or at least fiercely debated. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III, who fought a series of major battles against invading forces around 1177 before the Common Era, describe groups that modern scholars call the Sea Peoples, confederations of warriors, who attacked by both land and sea. The Egyptian text names several of these groups: the Peleset, the Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, and others. But these names cannot be confidently matched to known peoples, and it is far from clear that the Sea Peoples were responsible for all of the destruction attributed to the Bronze Age collapse. The Sea Peoples are one of the great enigmas of ancient history. Despite decades of scholarly debate, their origins remain uncertain. Some scholars have argued that the Peleset came from the Aegean world, perhaps from Crete or the Greek mainland, and that they are the ancestors of the biblical Philistines. The Shekelesh may be connected to Sicily. The Denyen might be related to the Danans, one of Homer's names for the Greeks. The Jekka are sometimes associated with the Troad, the region around Troy, but these identifications are speculative, based largely on the superficial similarity of names, and none has been confirmed by archaeological evidence. The Sea Peoples left no written records of their own. They left no cities that can be confidently attributed to their pre-migration homeland. They are known to us almost entirely through the records of the civilizations they attacked, which means we see them only through the distorted lens of enemy propaganda. Some scholars have argued that the Sea Peoples were not a cause of the collapse but a symptom of it. Refugees displaced by the very disruptions, famine, drought, political instability that were bringing the Bronze Age world to its knees. If the Mycenaean palace economies collapsed, leaving thousands of warriors, craftsmen, and laborers without employment or food, those displaced populations may have banded together and moved in search of new lands and resources, attacking the weakened civilizations they encountered along the way. On this reading, the Sea Peoples were not an invading army but a migration, a mass movement of desperate people driven from their homes by the same forces that were destroying the civilizations they attacked. Others have suggested that the collapse was driven primarily by internal factors, climatic change leading to drought and famine, overexploitation of agricultural land, disruption of trade routes by piracy and banditry, political instability within the great kingdoms, and the cascading failure of interdependent systems that could not survive the loss of any single component. The debate has been ongoing for over a century, and no consensus has been reached. What is clear is the scope of the destruction, which was vast, simultaneous, and devastating. Let us walk through the casualties, one by one, because the sheer scale of loss is difficult to grasp without enumeration. Hattusa, burned and abandoned. The Hittite Empire, dissolved completely, leaving no successor state in central Anatolia. The dozens of vassal kingdoms that had owed allegiance to the Hittite king, left without their overlord, most of them swept away in the chaos that followed. Ugarit, one of the great trading cities of the ancient world, located on the coast of modern Syria, destroyed around 1285 before the Common Era and never reoccupied. Ugarit was a marvel of the ancient world in its own right, a cosmopolitan port city where merchants from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Aegean world gathered to trade. Its population may have reached between 6,000 and 8,000 people, modest by modern standards but substantial for a Bronze Age trading city. The site has yielded one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. An archive of clay tablets written in multiple languages, including a local alphabetic script, the Ugaritic alphabet, which contained 30 symbols and is one of the earliest known alphabetic writing systems. The Ugaritic texts include mythological narratives about gods and heroes, Baal and Anat and El, that are related to the religious traditions later reflected in the Hebrew Bible. They include diplomatic correspondence, administrative records, legal documents, and personal letters that illuminate the daily life of a prosperous Bronze Age city in extraordinary detail. The last letters found at Ugarit include desperate pleas for military assistance from a king who knew his city was about to fall. One letter, from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, likely Cyprus, reads in part, "The enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my towns and have done very great damage in the country. All my troops are stationed in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca. The country is abandoned to itself." The letter reveals a critical detail. Ugarit's military forces were deployed elsewhere in the service of its Hittite overlord when the attack came. The vassal system that had been designed to provide collective security had left the vassal itself defenseless. The irony is devastating. Ugarit was destroyed in part because it was faithfully fulfilling its treaty obligations to the Hittite king, obligations that were supposed to protect it. Another letter found at the site was never sent. It was found in the kiln where it had been placed to be fired for durability, a standard practice for important documents. The letter was an appeal for help, but the city fell before the tablet could be fired, sent, and read. It sat in the kiln for over 3,000 years, a message that never reached its intended recipient, a cry for help that no one heard. These final letters from Ugarit are among the most poignant documents in all of archaeology. They give us something we almost never have from the ancient world, a real-time account of a civilization in its final moments. Not a retrospective description written by survivors or conquerors, not a mythological narrative composed centuries later, but the actual words of people who were living through the end of their world and who knew, or at least feared, what was coming. The urgency in the letters is palpable even across 32 centuries. These were not abstract discussions of geopolitical strategy. These were the words of people who were afraid. The Mycenaean palace states of Greece, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, all destroyed or abandoned within roughly a generation. The palace at Pylos, where archaeologists found an archive of over 1,000 Linear B tablets, documenting the administrative operations of the palace economy in obsessive detail, recording everything from the number of sheep in the royal flocks to the allocation of bronze for weapon production to the assignment of women workers to textile workshops, was burned around 1200 before the Common Era. The tablets survived only because the fire that destroyed the palace baked the clay, preserving it for posterity. Without that accidental preservation, we would know nothing of the administrative records of the Mycenaean world. After the destruction of the palaces, Greece entered a period of roughly 400 years known as the Greek Dark Ages. during which writing disappeared entirely from the Greek world, population declined dramatically, long-distance trade virtually ceased, and the level of material culture regressed to a state far below what it had been during the Mycenaean period. The Greek Dark Ages are one of the most dramatic examples of civilizational regression in the historical record. The Mycenaean Greeks had built massive stone fortifications, palatial complexes with frescoed walls, sophisticated drainage systems, and elaborate tomb structures. They had maintained an extensive bureaucratic administration recorded in Linear B. They had traded with every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. Within a century of the collapse, all of this was gone. The Greeks of the Dark Ages lived in small, scattered communities. They built in wood and mud brick, not stone. They had no writing. They had no monumental architecture. They made pottery that was cruder and less decorative than what had been produced in the palatial period. They had, to all appearances, lost the capacity to do what their great-grandparents had done routinely. When literacy returned to Greece, it came in a different form. The Greek alphabet, adapted from the Phoenician alphabet around 800 before the Common Era, bore no relationship to Linear B. The connection was severed. The Mycenaean world survived in Greek memory only as myth. The stories of the Trojan War, of Agamemnon and Odysseus and Achilles, tales of heroes and gods that preserved garbled echoes of the palatial age, but nothing of its administrative systems, its diplomatic protocols, or its economic organization. Homer sang of the wrath of Achilles. He said nothing about the distribution of barley rations in the palace of Pylos. And it gets worse. The destruction was not limited to the great powers. Smaller kingdoms and trading cities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean were caught in the same wave of collapse. The city of Alalak, in the Amuk plain of modern Turkey, a prosperous administrative centre that had served as a node in the Hittite imperial network for centuries, was destroyed and abandoned. Excavations at the site by Leonard Woolley in the 1930s and by later teams revealed destruction layers dating to precisely this period. Burned buildings, abandoned storerooms, the detritus of a community that had ceased to exist. The city of Carchemish on the Euphrates was attacked and partially destroyed, though it survived in diminished form as the seat of a small Neo-Hittite kingdom. Carchemish is notable because it represents one of the few cases where a Bronze Age city survived the collapse with some degree of cultural continuity, preserving elements of Hittite tradition for centuries. But it was a shadow of its former self, a provincial centre ruling a small territory, not a node in a great empire. Cities along the Levantine coast, from Tarsus in the north to Gaza in the south, show evidence of destruction or abandonment dating to this period. The great port of Byblos, which had maintained trade connections with Egypt for millennia, was severely disrupted. Inland, the massive Canaanite city of Hazor in the southern Levant was destroyed by fire around 1200 before the Common Era. The entire international trading system that had linked the Eastern Mediterranean world together, the system of exchange that had carried copper from Cyprus, tin from distant eastern sources, gold from Egypt, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic, and luxury goods from every corner of the known world, collapsed. The trade routes were cut. The shipping lanes were abandoned or became too dangerous to use. The workshops that had produced the exquisite goods, the ivory carvings, the faience jewellery, the bronze vessels and fine pottery that travelled along those routes fell silent. The Mediterranean world did not recover quickly from this catastrophe. The period that followed, roughly 1200 to 900 before the Common Era, was characterized by dramatically reduced populations, diminished trade, simpler material culture, and the loss of writing in most of the affected regions. It was a dark age in the most literal sense. A period when the lights that had shone across the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age were extinguished and not relit for centuries. When civilization re-emerged in the Iron Age, it did so in new forms with new languages, new writing systems, new political structures, and new cultural traditions. The continuity with the Bronze Age was broken. The world that emerged from the darkness was a new creation, built on the ruins of the old. The numbers are striking. Before the collapse, the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East contained at least 6 major literate civilizations: Egypt, Hatti, Babylon, Assyria, Mycenaean Greece, and Ugarit. After the collapse, only two, Egypt and Assyria, survived as functioning states with continuous literate traditions. Babylon survived but was severely weakened. The others were gone. Entire writing systems were lost. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, disappeared for 4 centuries. The Hittite cuneiform tradition ended entirely. The Ugaritic alphabetic script, one of the great innovations of the ancient world, died with the city that had created it. Knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries, the diplomatic archives, the religious texts, the legal codes, the medical and scientific documents, the horse training manuals, and the astronomical observations, all of it was buried, burned, or scattered, and much of it would not be recovered for nearly 3,000 years. The destruction of the Bronze Age international system was so complete that later civilizations had virtually no memory of it. The Greeks of the classical period, 500 years after the collapse, retained only garbled legends of the Mycenaean world, transformed into the mythological tales of the Trojan War, the voyages of Odysseus, and the deeds of Heracles. Homer, composing his epics around 800 before the Common Era, described a world of heroes and gods and fabulous wealth that bore some distant resemblance to the Mycenaean reality, but was overlaid with centuries of mythological elaboration and poetic invention. The real Mycenaean world, with its obsessive bureaucratic record-keeping, its palace-controlled economy, its redistributive systems, and its ration lists, would have been unrecognizable to Homer. He sang of glory and honor and divine intervention. The Linear B tablets speak of sheep tallies and bronze allocations and textile production quotas. The gap between the myth and the reality is vast, and it measures the depth of the forgetting. The classical Greeks had no knowledge whatsoever of the Hittite Empire. Not a single Greek text from the classical period mentions the Hittites by name or describes them in any recognizable way. This is astonishing when you consider that the Hittite Empire had been one of the dominant powers of the ancient world for centuries, that it had controlled territory that later became part of the Greek cultural sphere, and that the Hittites and the Mycenaean Greeks had been in direct diplomatic contact, as demonstrated by the references to Ahiawa in the Hittite archives. The Greeks of the 5th century before the Common Era walked on soil that had been administered by Hittite governors, passed through landscapes dominated by ruined Hittite fortifications, and had no idea that any of this had ever existed. The Persians, who conquered Anatolia in the 6th century before the Common Era and ruled the territory that had once been the Hittite heartland for over 2 centuries, left no record of any awareness that a great empire had preceded them there. The Romans, who later controlled the same territory, were equally ignorant. For nearly 3,000 years, one of the great civilizations of the ancient world existed only as a few obscure references in the Bible, a handful of puzzling mentions in Egyptian inscriptions, and some mysterious hieroglyphic monuments in Turkey and Syria that no one could read, a ghost empire that scholars debated and doubted until Hugo Winkler broke open the earth at Bogazkal and the ghosts became flesh. This is not science fiction. This is the documented, archaeological, textually confirmed history of a real civilization that was once a superpower of the ancient world, and that was so thoroughly destroyed and forgotten that the modern world required an act of excavation to learn that it had ever existed. The completeness of the erasure is almost incomprehensible. We are accustomed to thinking of history as a continuous record, a narrative stretching from the distant past to the present, with each generation passing its knowledge to the next. The Hittite case shows us that this is an illusion. The record is not continuous. It is full of gaps, silences, and lacunae, where entire civilizations lived and died, and left nothing behind but ruins that later peoples could not explain, and inscriptions that later scholars could not read. The Hittite erasure is particularly instructive because the empire was not obscure during its existence. It was one of the best known and most powerful states in the ancient world. The pharaohs of Egypt knew it intimately. The kings of Babylon and Assyria traded with it and feared it. The Mycenaean Greeks were aware of it and had diplomatic contact with it. It was, by every measure, a major player on the world stage. And yet, within a few centuries of its fall, all knowledge of its existence and been lost outside of a few cryptic biblical references and some puzzling Egyptian inscriptions that scholars could not contextualize. The completeness of the forgetting is what makes it so disturbing. If a civilization this powerful, this well documented, this thoroughly integrated into the international system of its day can be forgotten so completely, what does that say about the durability of historical memory? What does it say about our own confidence that the achievements of our civilization will be remembered? But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The search for answers to the Bronze Age collapse has consumed generations of scholars, and the explanations that have been proposed are as varied and complex as the catastrophe itself. The collapse has been called the worst disaster in ancient history, a civilizational reset that erased centuries of accumulated knowledge and plunged an entire region into darkness for hundreds of years. Each theory that has been advanced captures a genuine aspect of the collapse. None captures all of it. Let us examine the major proposals, one by one, and see what they reveal about the vulnerability of the interconnected world that the Hittites and their contemporaries had built, and what they tell us about the vulnerability of our own. The first and oldest explanation is the invasion theory, the idea that the Bronze Age civilizations were destroyed by external invaders, specifically the enigmatic sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian records. This theory dominated early scholarship and retains a certain dramatic appeal. The Egyptian evidence is vivid. The temple walls at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Thebes, contain elaborate carved reliefs depicting the pharaoh's battles against the sea peoples, showing enemy warriors in distinctive feathered headdresses fighting from ships and war chariots. The accompanying inscriptions describe the invaders in apocalyptic terms, claiming that they swept away all opposition in their path, destroying the Hittites, the people of Carchemish, the Cypriots, and the cities of the Levantine coast before being stopped, finally, by the forces of Egypt. But the invasion theory has significant weaknesses. The Egyptian accounts are royal propaganda commissioned by Ramesses III to glorify his military achievements and cannot be taken at face value. Pharaohs routinely exaggerated their victories and minimized their setbacks, and the dramatic reliefs at Medinet Habu should be read as political theatre rather than objective historical reporting. The Sea Peoples, whoever they were, do not appear in the archaeological record as a clearly identifiable cultural group with distinctive pottery, weapons, architectural styles, or burial practices that can be traced back to a specific homeland. The Peliset, who settled on the coast of modern Israel at Malplata after the collapse and gave their name to the region, Palestine, can be partially traced in the archaeological record through pottery and building techniques that show Aegean influences. But the other named groups remain shadows, names on a wall without archaeological substance. Most importantly, the invasion theory does not explain why the great powers of the Bronze Age, which had maintained powerful professional armies, extensive fortification systems, and centuries of accumulated military experience, were unable to defend themselves against what appears to have been a relatively loosely organized collection of migrant warrior groups. The Hittites alone could field an army of tens of thousands of trained soldiers, supported by hundreds of heavy chariots, each crewed by a driver, a shield-bearer, and a warrior. They had massive fortified cities with walls 8 meters thick. They had a military tradition stretching back centuries and a sophisticated chain of command. How could such a force be overwhelmed by bands of Theban raiders armed with bronze swords? The question is not merely academic. It suggests that the invasion theory, while it may capture one dimension of the crisis, cannot be the whole explanation. Something else must have weakened the great powers before the Sea Peoples delivered the final blow. The second explanation focuses on climate change and environmental stress. Paleoclimatic evidence from multiple sources, including tree ring data from Anatolia, pollen records from the Levant, sediment cores from lakes and seas across the eastern Mediterranean, and isotopic analysis of cave formations, has revealed that the period around 1200 before the Common Era coincided with a significant climatic event, a prolonged drought, that affected much of the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. The drought appears to have lasted for roughly 300 years, from approximately 1200 to 900 before the Common Era, though its most severe phase may have been shorter. This climatic shift reduced agricultural productivity, stressed water supplies, and may have triggered famines in regions that had previously been able to feed their populations. The evidence from Anatolia is particularly relevant to the Hittite case. Tree ring data from ancient timbers recovered from archaeological sites in central Turkey shows a period of significantly reduced growth, beginning around 1200 before the Common Era, consistent with drought conditions. Pollen cores from lakes in the Anatolian interior show a shift from agricultural pollen, indicating cultivated fields, to steppe vegetation, indicating abandoned farmland during the same period. The letter from the Hittite king to the king of Ugarit, requesting emergency grain shipments, mentioned earlier, takes on new significance in this context. If the Hittite heartland was experiencing a prolonged drought, the empire's agricultural base would have been under severe stress. The ability to feed the large population of Hattusa, the military garrison, the bureaucracy, the temple establishments, and the civilian population would have been compromised. An empire that could not feed its capital was an empire in crisis. There is also a growing body of evidence suggesting that seismic activity may have played a role in the destruction of certain Bronze Age cities. The eastern Mediterranean lies along a tectonically active zone, and major earthquakes have struck the region repeatedly throughout history. The archaeologist Amos Nur has argued that a series of earthquakes, possibly triggered by fault movement along the North Anatolian Fault and the Dead Sea Transform, could have damaged or destroyed several Bronze Age cities within a relatively short period. Archaeological evidence of earthquake damage has been identified at several sites that were destroyed during the collapse period, including Mycenae, Tiryns, and possibly Troy. However, the earthquake theory has been criticized for being difficult to verify archaeologically, since the damage caused by earthquakes can be hard to distinguish from damage caused by military attack or simple structural decay. Most scholars consider earthquakes a possible contributing factor, but not a sufficient explanation for the collapse on their own. But climate change alone does not explain the collapse. Droughts had occurred before in the ancient world, and civilizations had survived them. Egypt endured catastrophic low Nile floods during the First Intermediate Period, around 2200 before the Common Era, and survived, eventually reconsolidating under the Middle Kingdom. Mesopotamian civilizations had coped with salinization of irrigated soils and periods of reduced rainfall. The question is not whether drought occurred, but whether the societies affected by it were capable of adapting, and if not, why not? What made this particular drought different was not its severity alone, but the fact that it struck a world that had become so interconnected, so interdependent, that the failure of one component triggered a chain reaction that brought down the entire system. The third explanation, and the one that has gained the most traction among scholars in recent years, is the systems collapse theory. This approach, associated most prominently with the archaeologist Eric Klein, whose 2014 book on the subject became a landmark in the field, and drawing on earlier work by scholars including Joseph Tainter and Mario Liverani, argues that the Bronze Age collapse was not caused by any single factor, but by the simultaneous failure of multiple interconnected systems. The great kingdoms of the Late Bronze Age were linked together in a web of trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence. Each kingdom depended on the others for critical resources: copper from Cyprus, tin from distant sources required for bronze production, grain from Egypt and the fertile river valleys, timber from the mountains of Lebanon and Anatolia, luxury goods that maintained the prestige economies of the royal courts. When one component of this system failed, the effects cascaded through the entire network. Imagine the system as a structure held together by a series of supporting cables. Each cable represents a critical connection: a trade route, a diplomatic relationship, an agricultural surplus, a military alliance. The structure can survive the failure of one or two cables. It may even survive 3 or 4. But at some point, a critical threshold is crossed, and the remaining cables cannot bear the additional load transferred to them. The structure does not sag gradually. It collapses suddenly and catastrophically. This is what appears to have happened in the Bronze Age world. Drought reduced agricultural output across the region. Famine triggered population movements as desperate people moved in search of food and land. Moving populations disrupted trade routes, which were vulnerable to banditry and instability. Disrupted trade routes cut off the supply of tin, without which bronze weapons and tools could not be manufactured. The loss of bronze production weakened military capability, since bronze was the critical military metal of the age. Weakened military capability emboldened attackers, both external, the sea peoples, and internal, vassal states seizing the opportunity to throw off imperial control. Each failure made the next failure more likely, and the cascading chain of disruptions brought down the entire system within a single generation. The Hittite Empire was particularly vulnerable to this kind of cascading failure for several reasons. Unlike Egypt, which had the Nile as a reliable, centralized source of water and agricultural productivity, the Hittite heartland depended on rainfall agriculture in a region where rainfall was marginal and variable. A few dry years in succession could turn a productive agricultural landscape into a famine zone. Unlike Mesopotamia, which had extensive irrigation systems that could buffer against short-term rainfall variability, Central Anatolia had limited irrigation infrastructure, partly because the terrain, a high plateau cut by deep valleys, was poorly suited to large-scale canal construction. The Hittite Empire was also geographically overextended, controlling territories that stretched from the Aegean coast to the upper Euphrates, connected by mountain roads that were slow, difficult, and vulnerable to interdiction by hostile forces. Moving armies or supplies from one end of the empire to the other could take weeks, and in winter, many mountain passes were impassable. When the system came under stress from multiple directions simultaneously, the empire's ability to respond was crippled by the difficulties of projecting power across vast distances of rugged terrain. There is a specific detail from the archaeological record that illustrates the Hittite vulnerability with particular vividness. At the site of Kuzakli, a Hittite provincial center in eastern Turkey, excavations have revealed a settlement that was heavily dependent on grain storage. Large granary buildings dominated the site, indicating that the community's survival depended on its ability to store surplus grain from good harvest years to survive bad ones. When the drought struck, the buffer of stored grain would have been consumed. Once the granaries were empty and the harvests continued to fail, the community had no options. Sites like Kusakli show us the ground-level reality of what the grand geopolitical narratives often obscure. Real people in real communities facing starvation because the rains had stopped and the grain had run out. There is a fourth explanation that focuses specifically on the Hittite case, the theory of internal political instability. The Hittite monarchy had always been plagued by dynastic conflict. The Hittite system of royal succession was contested and unclear, with different branches of the royal family often vying for the throne, and the history of the empire is punctuated by coups, assassinations, and civil wars. Hattusili III himself had seized power from his nephew Uhi-Teshub in a coup that he justified in an elaborate apologia text found in the Hattusa archive, claiming that the goddess Ishtar had personally commanded him to take the throne. The fact that he felt the need to write such a justifications suggests that the legitimacy of his rule was questioned, and the dynastic tensions he introduced may have weakened the empire in its final decades. In the last years of the empire, there is evidence of increasing internal tension. The last king, Suppiluliuma II, may have faced challenges to his authority from rival factions within the royal family. Vassal states in western Anatolia, particularly the kingdom of Arzawa and its successor states, appear to have been increasingly restive, seeking to break free from Hittite control. A mysterious entity called Yahiyawa, which many scholars identify with Mycenaean Greece, had been meddling in western Anatolian affairs for decades, encouraging anti-Hittite sentiment among the local populations. The empire's military resources may have been stretched impossibly thin by the need to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously against Western Anatolian rebels against threats from the rising power of Assyria to the east, against unknown enemies by sea, and against internal dissidents who saw the weakening of central authority as an opportunity to seize power for themselves. The combination of external threats and internal divisions created a perfect storm, an empire that was militarily overstretched, agriculturally stressed by drought, economically weakened by the disruption of trade routes, and politically divided by dynastic rivalries, was in no position to withstand the kind of multi-directional assault that appears to have overwhelmed it in its final years. The Hittite Empire may have been in a state of slow disintegration for decades before the final blow fell. A fifth angle of analysis examines the role of technology, specifically the emerging iron technology that was beginning to replace bronze during this period. The Hittites are often credited with being among the first peoples to develop the smelting of iron, though the extent of their iron-working capabilities is debated. What is clear is that the late Bronze Age economy was heavily dependent on bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Copper was relatively abundant, available from major sources in Cyprus, Anatolia, and Oman, but tin was rare, coming from distant sources in Afghanistan, Central Asia, and possibly Cornwall in distant Britain. The trade routes that brought tin to the workshops of the Bronze Age world were long, complex, and extraordinarily vulnerable. They crossed multiple political jurisdictions, traversed dangerous mountain passes and open seas, and depended on the stability of every polity along the way. When those routes were disrupted, as they appear to have been during the collapse, the supply of tin was cut off, and the ability to manufacture bronze weapons, tools, and implements was crippled. Bronze was not merely a luxury material, it was the foundation of the military, agricultural, and economic life of the Bronze Age world. Weapons were made of bronze. Agricultural tools were made of bronze. The very name of the era reflects the centrality of this material to every aspect of civilization. When the tin supply was interrupted, the entire technological foundation of the Bronze Age world was undermined. Some scholars have argued that the transition from bronze to iron technology was not a cause of the collapse, but a consequence of it. When bronze became unavailable, because the tin trade routes had been severed, smiths were forced to experiment with iron as a substitute material. Iron ore was far more widely available than tin, existing in significant deposits across Anatolia, the Levant, and the Aegean. But ironworking required different techniques than bronze working. Higher temperatures, different fuel requirements, and a different set of skills. The development of these techniques was gradual, and the earliest iron objects were often of poorer quality than the bronze tools they replaced. It took centuries for iron technology to mature to the point where it surpassed bronze in utility. In the meantime, the collapse of the bronze economy left communities across the eastern Mediterranean with a severe shortage of metal for weapons, tools, and other essential items. This shortage may have contributed to the decline in material culture that characterized the centuries following the collapse. Now let us look beyond the Hittites and see how this pattern of collapse played out across the Bronze Age world and beyond, because the parallels with other lost civilizations sharpen the lesson immeasurably. Consider the fate of Mycenaean Greece, the Hittites' contemporary and sometime rival. The Mycenaean civilization, centered on the great palace complexes at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes, was a warrior culture ruled by powerful kings called Wanaks, who controlled surrounding territories through a system of redistribution. The palace collected agricultural produce, craft goods, and labor from the surrounding population and redistributed them according to the needs of the state, feeding the military, supplying the craftsmen, and funding the religious establishment. This system, meticulously documented in the Linear B tablets, was enormously productive. It supported large populations, funded ambitious building programs, including the massive Cyclopean fortification walls at Mycenae and Tiryns, and generated the wealth that allowed Mycenaean traders to operate across the entire eastern Mediterranean, from southern Italy and Sicily in the west to the Levantine coast and Egypt in the east. But the system was also inflexible. The palace economy depended on centralized control, with the Wanaks and his officials managing the production and distribution of virtually all goods and services. There was, As far as we can tell from the Linear B records, no significant private economic sector operating independently of the palace. When the palaces were destroyed, the entire economic structure collapsed with them. There was no backup system. There were no independent merchants or private enterprises that could fill the gap left by the fallen palaces. The result was not merely a change in political leadership, but a complete economic collapse. The workshops closed, the trade routes were abandoned, the specialized skills of the palace craftsmen, the fresco painters, the bronze workers, the ivory carvers, the perfume makers, were lost because there was no institutional framework to support them. Writing disappeared, building in stone ceased, long-distance trade virtually ended. The level of material culture regressed so dramatically that if an archaeologist from the 12th century before the Common Era could have visited Greece 3 centuries later, they would have found a world that looked more like the distant past than the recent one. Consider Mohenjo-Daro, the great city of the Indus Valley civilization, which had collapsed roughly 700 years before the Bronze Age collapse under strikingly similar circumstances. Environmental change, particularly the weakening of monsoon rainfall and the drying of the Gagahakra river system, the disruption of long-distance trade networks that had connected the Indus cities to Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf, and the dispersal of urban populations into smaller, more sustainable rural settlements. The Indus civilization's decline followed the same broad pattern as the Bronze Age collapse, not a sudden military defeat but a slow, cascading failure of interconnected systems that ended in the abandonment of the great cities and the loss of the writing system. The Indus script, like Linear B and Hittite cuneiform, disappeared when the institutional framework that had sustained literacy was dismantled. The parallel between the Indus collapse and the Bronze Age collapse is particularly important because it demonstrates that the vulnerability of complex, networked civilizations to cascading failure is not limited to a particular region, time period, or cultural context. It is a universal property of complexity itself, a structural vulnerability built into every society that achieves a high level of interconnection and specialization. Consider the ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest, whose great houses at Chaco Canyon were abandoned around 1275 of the Common Era, roughly 2.5 millennia after the Bronze Age collapse. The Chaco system, centered on the massive great houses of Pueblo Bonito, Chetroketle, and their satellites, was a network of interconnected communities linked by trade in turquoise, timber, and other goods, by shared ritual practices centered on the Great Kivas, and by a system of roads that connected outlying communities to the Chaco Center across tens of thousands of square kilometers of desert landscape. When the system came under stress from the Great Drought of the late 1200s, it fragmented. The great houses were abandoned. The roads were no longer maintained. The population dispersed into smaller, more localized communities. The knowledge embedded in the Chaco system's institutions, whatever organizational, astronomical, or engineering expertise had been required to plan and execute the construction of its monumental buildings, was dispersed and eventually lost. Consider the classic Maya collapse around 800 to 900 of the Common Era, when the great cities of the southern lowlands were abandoned in the face of prolonged drought, intensifying warfare between rival kingdoms, environmental degradation from centuries of deforestation and intensive agriculture, and the breakdown of the agricultural systems that had sustained dense populations in a fragile tropical environment. The Maya, like the Hittites, had a sophisticated writing system, monumental architecture, and a complex network of political alliances and rivalries. Like the Hittites, they maintained elaborate diplomatic traditions, recorded the deeds of their kings in inscriptions on stone monuments, and accumulated specialized knowledge in astronomy, mathematics, and agriculture that was transmitted through institutional channels. And like the Hittites, the Maya saw their cities emptied, their inscriptions cease, their writing system fall into partial disuse, and much of their accumulated knowledge dispersed or lost within a few generations. Consider also the example of Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, which flourished in the Mississippi River floodplain near present-day St. Louis, around 1050 to 1150 of the Common Era, and was abandoned by roughly 1300. Cahokia was the center of a regional system that extended across much of the central Mississippi Valley, linked by trade in marine shell, copper, and other prestige goods, and by shared ceremonial practices centered on monumental earthen mounds. Like the Bronze Age system, the Cahokia system was a network. And like the Bronze Age system, it collapsed when the network came under stress, in this case from a combination of environmental change, resource depletion, and internal social conflict. The great mounds of Cahokia were left standing, empty monuments to a way of life that had vanished. Each of these cases, the Mycenaeans, the Indus Valley, Chaco Canyon, the classic Maya, Cahokia, and the Hittites themselves, illustrates a different facet of the same fundamental phenomenon: the vulnerability of complex, networked civilizations to cascading failure. But there are important differences between them that sharpen the lesson. The Indus collapse was primarily environmental. The Maya collapse involved both environmental and military factors. The Bronze Age collapse was uniquely devastating because it involved the simultaneous failure of an entire international system, not just a single civilization, but a web of interconnected civilizations that depended on one another for survival. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so relevant to our modern world. We live in an international system far more tightly integrated than anything the Bronze Age world could have achieved, and the potential for cascading failure is proportionally greater. The Bronze Age collapse also illustrates a specific type of vulnerability that is worth naming explicitly: the vulnerability of systems optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. The Bronze Age trade networks evolved over centuries to move goods efficiently from source to consumer, minimizing cost and maximizing profit. The palace economies of the Mycenaean world were optimized for centralized control, maximizing the surplus that could be extracted from the population. The Hittite vassal system was optimized for military cooperation, maximizing the force that could be deployed against any single threat. These systems worked extraordinarily well under normal conditions, but they had very little resilience, very little ability to absorb shocks and continue functioning when conditions changed. The trade routes had no redundancy. When the main route was cut, there was no backup. The palace economies had no decentralized alternative. When the palace fell, the economy collapsed. The vassal system had no mechanism for collective defense when the overlord was itself under threat. Ugarit's forces were deployed in the service of the Hittite king when the city itself was attacked. The systems were brittle. They worked perfectly until they did not work at all, and when they stopped working, they stopped suddenly, completely, and catastrophically. Our modern systems share this characteristic to a disturbing degree. Our supply chains are optimized for efficiency, using just-in-time delivery systems that minimize inventory costs but leave no buffer when disruptions occur. Our financial systems are optimized for growth, using complex instruments and leveraged positions that maximize returns but amplify losses. Our energy systems are optimized for cost, concentrating production in a few large facilities rather than distributing it across many smaller ones. In each case, the optimization for efficiency comes at the expense of resilience. The system works beautifully when everything is functioning normally, but when a disruption occurs, the lack of redundancy means that the failure cascades rapidly through the system, affecting sectors and communities that had no direct connection to the original disruption. This is precisely the dynamic that brought down the Bronze Age world, scaled up to a global level, and accelerated by the speed of modern communication and transportation. The pattern is consistent across cultures, continents, and millennia. Complex civilizations that depend on interconnected networks of trade, resource exchange, and institutional cooperation are vulnerable to cascading failure when those networks are disrupted. The disruption can come from climate change, from external invasion, from internal political instability, from technological disruption, or from any combination of these factors. But the result is always the same. The network fragments, the cities empty, the writing systems are abandoned or lost, and the accumulated knowledge of centuries vanishes into the silence that follows collapse. The Hittite Empire was not uniquely fragile, It was an example of a universal pattern, a pattern that has repeated itself across the full span of human history, and that shows no of having been overcome by modern technology or modern governance. If anything, the increasing complexity and tight coupling of modern systems may make us more vulnerable to cascading failure, not less. The Bronze Age world was connected. Our world is hyperconnected. The Bronze Age world was interdependent. Our world is hyperdependent. The scale has changed. The principles have not. The math is striking when we consider what was lost specifically from the Hittite world. The Hittite archive at Hattusa, containing over 30,000 tablets, is an extraordinary treasure of information about the Bronze Age world, but it represents only what survived the destruction of the city and the subsequent 3,000 years of exposure to the elements, looting, and decay. How many tablets were taken when the court evacuated Hattusa? Where did they go? Were they carried to one of the Neo-Hittite successor states, perhaps Karchemish or Hamath? If so, they have not been found. Were they buried along the road by refugees who could not carry them further? Were they deliberately destroyed by invaders who had no use for the records of a conquered empire? We do not know. The archive we have is almost certainly a fraction, perhaps a small fraction, of what once existed, and even that fraction has transformed our understanding of the ancient world, revealing a civilization of remarkable sophistication that had been entirely unknown to modern scholarship before 1906. Every tablet recovered at Hattusa is a message from a world that was, until a century ago, completely forgotten. Every text translated is a voice rescued from 3,000 years of oblivion. The thought of how much more was lost, how many voices were silenced permanently, how many insights and achievements and human experiences were erased beyond recovery, is difficult to contemplate without a sense of deep and enduring loss. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling. The deeper truth about the destruction of Hattusa and the Bronze Age collapse is not about ancient history. It is about the nature of complexity itself and the hidden vulnerabilities that lurk within every interconnected system, including especially our own. We live in a world that is far more interconnected than anything the Bronze Age kings could have imagined. Our trade networks span the entire globe. Our communication systems operate at the speed of light. Our economies are linked by chains of supply and demand that stretch across continents and oceans. We depend every day on the smooth functioning of systems so complex that no single person fully understands them. The electricity that powers our homes comes from power plants that burn fuel shipped from distant countries, generating current that flows through a grid maintained by thousands of workers, regulated by software, written by programmers who have never met the engineers who designed the physical infrastructure. The food on our tables has been grown, harvested, processed, packaged, transported, stored, and sold by a chain of specialized workers, each one dependent on all the others, stretching from farms in one hemisphere to kitchens in another. This interdependence is the source of our extraordinary prosperity. It is also the source of our extraordinary vulnerability, because the same principle that brought down the Bronze Age world, the cascading failure of interconnected systems, operates in our world with equal force and at a far greater scale. When a critical supply chain is disrupted, the effects ripple outward, affecting industries and communities that had no direct connection to the original disruption. When a financial system fails, the contagion spreads through markets and economies linked by invisible threads of credit and debt. When an infrastructure system breaks down, whether through natural disaster, cyber attack, or simple neglect, the services that depend on it fail in sequence, like dominoes falling in a line. The Bronze Age kings would recognize this dynamic immediately. They experienced it firsthand. The only difference is scale. Our network is global. Theirs was regional. The principles are the same. The risks are proportionally larger. Let that sink in. The Bronze Age world collapsed because it was connected, not despite its connections, but because of them. The trade networks that made the great powers rich also made them dependent on one another for essential resources that they could not produce domestically. The diplomatic relationships that maintained peace also created expectations and obligations that, when unfulfilled, led to conflict and betrayal. The specialization that produced exquisite goods and advanced technologies also meant that no single kingdom possessed the full range of skills and materials needed to function independently. When the connections failed, the kingdoms failed with them, and the more connected they were, the more catastrophic the failure was. This is a principle that modern systems theorists call tight coupling. In a tightly coupled system, the components are so closely interdependent that a failure in one component immediately affects all the others. There is no slack, no buffer, no redundancy. The system operates with maximum efficiency when everything is working, but it is maximally vulnerable when anything goes wrong. The Bronze Age international system was tightly coupled. Each kingdom needed the others. Egypt needed copper from Cyprus and tin from the east. The Hittites needed grain from Syria and luxury goods from Egypt to maintain their prestige economy. Ugarit needed the Hittite military umbrella for protection and the Egyptian and Mesopotamian markets for trade. Mycenaean Greece needed tin, gold, ivory, and the eastern markets for its manufactured goods. Pull one thread and the whole fabric unravels. The Hittite Empire illustrates this principle with painful clarity. Hattusa was not self-sufficient, it could not be. No Bronze Age capital of that size could be. The city's enormous population, perhaps 40,000 people at its peak, including the royal court, the temple priesthoods, the military garrison, the administrative bureaucracy, and the civilian population of craftsmen, merchants, and laborers, could not be fed from the surrounding agricultural land alone, particularly in a region where rainfall agriculture was marginal and unpredictable. It depended on grain imports from the fertile lowlands of Syria and the coastal plains of southern Anatolia, regions that were hundreds of kilometers away and connected to the capital by mountain roads that were difficult, slow, and vulnerable to disruption. It depended on copper from the mines of Cyprus, shipped across the Mediterranean and then hauled overland to the Anatolian plateau, and on tin from distant eastern sources, carried by caravan routes that stretched thousands of kilometers across the mountains and deserts of Central Asia. It depended on tribute and trade goods from its vassal states, the dozens of smaller kingdoms bound to the Hittite king by treaty and oath to fund its military establishment and maintain the prestige economy that legitimated royal power and sustained the loyalty of the empire's diverse populations. When drought reduced the grain supply from Syria and the coastal plains, when trade routes were disrupted by warfare, banditry, or the movements of displaced populations, when vassal states stopped paying tribute because they were themselves under attack or in revolt, the city became unsustainable. The same walls that had protected Hattusa for centuries became a trap, enclosing a population that could no longer be fed. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the permanence of prosperity. We assume that wealth, once accumulated, will be maintained. We assume that knowledge, once gained, will be preserved. We assume that institutions, once built, will endure. We assume that the trajectory of human civilization is upward, that progress is cumulative, that the achievements of each generation are added permanently to those of the previous one in an ever-growing edifice of knowledge and capability. This assumption is so deeply embedded in our worldview that we rarely question it. It feels self-evident, it feels like the natural order of things. But the Hittite case and the broader Bronze Age collapse show us that this assumption is historically unfounded and potentially dangerous. Prosperity is not a permanent state. It is a condition that must be actively, continuously, institutionally maintained through effort, investment, adaptation, and vigilance. When the conditions that support prosperity change, and when the systems designed to maintain it are unable to adapt quickly enough to the new conditions, the result is not a gentle decline, not a gradual tapering off, but a catastrophic failure. The Bronze Age world did not gradually wind down, it shattered within a single generation, and much of what it had produced, much of what it had known, much of what it had achieved through centuries of accumulated effort was lost forever. The loss of the Hittite Empire was not just a political or military event. It was an intellectual catastrophe of the first order. The Hittite archive contained knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries. Legal principles, diplomatic practices, religious traditions, medical knowledge, military techniques, and the institutional memory of a complex, multi-ethnic, multilingual empire. When the empire fell, all of that knowledge was lost, not suppressed by a conquering power, not destroyed in a deliberate act of cultural vandalism, simply lost because the institutions that had maintained it, the scribal schools, the temple priesthoods, the royal court, the provincial administrations, ceased to exist. The knowledge had no vessel to carry it forward, and so it sank into oblivion. Let that sink in. The Hittites knew things that the modern world did not rediscover until the 20th century. They had developed diplomatic practices that anticipated modern international law by 3,000 years. They had a legal system that was in some respects more humane than those of their contemporaries. They had horse training techniques that are consistent with modern equine science. They had metallurgical knowledge, particularly in ironworking, that was at the cutting edge of Bronze Age technology. They had religious texts that preserved myths and rituals from multiple cultural traditions, providing modern scholars with invaluable insights into the religious landscape of the ancient Near East. They had medical texts that described treatments and remedies drawn from centuries of accumulated observation. All of this knowledge was lost when the empire fell. The world was diminished by the loss, and for 3,000 years, no one even knew what had been lost. The loss of the Hittite legal tradition is particularly poignant. The Hittite laws, preserved in multiple copies in the Hattusa archive, represent one of the most sophisticated legal systems of the ancient world. They cover an extraordinary range of subjects: homicide, assault, theft, property damage, agricultural disputes, sexual offenses, sorcery, trade regulation, slavery, and the obligations of different social classes. The laws are notable for their emphasis on compensation and restitution rather than physical punishment. A murderer was not executed, but was required to provide persons to the victim's family, essentially replacement members for the household. Theft was punished by repayment of multiple times the value of stolen goods. Even in cases of serious bodily harm, the penalty was typically financial compensation, calculated according to a detailed schedule that distinguished between injuries to free persons and injuries to slaves, between injuries suffered in fights and injuries suffered by accident. This approach to justice focused on restoring the victim and the community, rather than punishing the offender, has remarkable parallels with modern restorative justice movements. It represents a legal philosophy that was genuinely ahead of its time, and that was lost for 3 millennia when the empire collapsed. The loss of the Hittite diplomatic archive is equally significant for our understanding of human civilizational achievement. The treaties, correspondence, and diplomatic protocols preserved at Hattusa constitute the most complete record of international relations from any ancient civilization. They document a system of interstate relations that was, in many ways, more sophisticated than anything that would exist in the Western world until the European state system emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries of the Common Era. The Hittite treaties included detailed provisions for mutual defense, non-aggression, extradition of political refugees, trade regulation, dispute resolution through arbitration, and the protection of diplomatic envoys. They were sealed with oaths sworn before the gods of both parties, creating a framework of religious sanction that gave the agreements a moral weight beyond mere political calculation. The concept of international law as a system of binding agreements between sovereign states, enforced by mutual obligation and divine witness, was not invented by Hugo Grotius in the 17th century. It was practiced by the Hittites more than 3,000 years earlier. The loss of this tradition when the empire fell was not just a local event. It was a setback for the entire concept of regulated interstate relations, a concept that would have to be reinvented from scratch at enormous human cost by civilizations that had no knowledge that it had ever existed before. The parallel to our own time is uncomfortable but unavoidable. Our world, like the Bronze Age world, is rich in knowledge, rich in institutions, rich in connections, and like the Bronze Age world, our knowledge is not stored in some indestructible vault. It is distributed across institutions, organizations, and individuals, each one dependent on the others for support and continuity. A university produces knowledge, but it depends on funding, which depends on a functioning economy, which depends on stable political institutions, which depend on a social contract, which depends on the belief of the population that the system is working. Pull out any one of these supports, and the entire structure becomes unstable. We store our knowledge on digital media with lifespans measured in decades, not centuries. We encode our information in formats that become obsolete within years. We depend on electrical grids, server farms, and communication networks that are vulnerable to natural disasters, cyber attacks, and simple infrastructure degradation. The ancient Hittites stored their knowledge on clay tablets, which, as it turned out, are remarkably durable. Many of the tablets from Hattusa survived 3,000 years of burial in reasonably readable condition. Our hard drives, our solid-state storage, our optical disks would not last a fraction of that time. There is a concept in information science called digital dark age, the idea that future generations may be unable to access the vast quantities of digital information produced by our civilization, because the hardware, software, and formats needed to read that information will no longer exist. The term was coined by Vinton Cerf, one of the architects of the Internet, and it describes a scenario that is already playing out in the present day. Data stored on obsolete media, in obsolete formats, on servers maintained by defunct companies, is being lost every day. Websites disappear, databases are corrupted, files become unreadable. The accumulated digital output of our civilization is leaking away, slowly but steadily, and we have no comprehensive plan to stop the leak. The irony is that the ancient clay tablets of Hattusa have proven to be a more durable storage medium than anything our civilization has produced. A clay tablet, once baked or even sun-dried, can survive for thousands of years under reasonable conditions. Many of the Hattusa tablets were readable after 3,000 years of burial. Our magnetic hard drives last perhaps 10 years. Our optical disks last perhaps 20. Our solid-state storage is better, but still measured in decades, not centuries. Our paper books, under ideal conditions, might last a few hundred years. The most enduring information medium in human history is stone, which can last for millennia, but we do not engrave our knowledge on stone. We store it on media that degrade, in formats that become obsolete, behind passwords that are forgotten, on servers that crash, in databases maintained by companies that go bankrupt. The vulnerability is profound. The Hittites, ironically, would have understood this vulnerability better than most modern people. They knew that knowledge was fragile. Their scribes copied important texts multiple times, storing copies in different locations. Their archives were maintained by professional archivists who understood the importance of preservation. And still, most of what they wrote was lost. The fact that 30,000 tablets survived is a testament to the durability of clay and the diligence of the scribes. But it is also a reminder that even the most durable media and the most careful preservation practices cannot protect knowledge against the collapse of the institutions that maintain them. This is not science fiction. This is the world we live in, and the Hittite precedent shows us what happens when a civilization's knowledge is not actively, continuously, institutionally maintained. It disappears, completely, permanently, without warning, without anyone noticing until it is too late. The deeper truth about Hattusa is that it was not destroyed by an enemy. It was destroyed by the failure of the systems that sustained it. The drought was not an enemy. It was an environmental change that could not be controlled, only endured. The sea peoples were not an enemy in the conventional sense. They may have been refugees, displaced populations, pushed into motion by the same environmental and economic stresses that were undermining the great powers, or they may have been opportunistic raiders, exploiting the weakness of a system already in decline. The collapse of the trade networks was not an attack. It was a consequence of the interconnection that had made the trade networks possible in the first place. Each kingdom's dependence on the others was both its strength and its vulnerability, and when the dependencies failed, the kingdoms failed with them. The Hittite Empire did not fall to a superior force. It fell because the world it had been built to function in ceased to exist. The climate changed, the trade routes closed, the grain stopped coming, the vassals stopped obeying, and the great city on the hilltop, with its massive walls and its carved lions and its archive of 30,000 tablets, became an empty shell and then a ruin and then a memory, and then not even a memory. There is one final aspect of this story that deserves contemplation: the nature of the forgetting itself. The Hittites were not a minor people. They were one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. Their empire lasted for roughly 450 years in its various phases. They interacted with every major power of their era. Their king corresponded as an equal with the pharaoh of Egypt. Their treaties were carved in silver and exchanged between courts separated by thousands of kilometers. And yet, within a few centuries of the empire's fall, they had been forgotten so thoroughly that later peoples living on the same soil, speaking the same languages that had once been part of the Hittite linguistic landscape, had no memory of them. The Phrygians, who moved into central Anatolia after the Hittite collapse, built their own kingdom without any apparent awareness that a great empire had preceded them. The Lydians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans all ruled Anatolia in succession, and none of them knew about the Hittites. This is a kind of forgetting that goes beyond simple ignorance. It is an active erasure of the historical record, not by censorship or suppression, but by the natural processes of cultural replacement and memory decay. When the institutions that maintain knowledge of the Hittite past, the scribal schools, the temple priesthoods, the royal archives, ceased to function, the knowledge they had preserved began to decay. Within a generation, the details were fuzzy. Within a century, only the broad outlines remained. Within a few centuries, even the outlines were gone, replaced by the myths and legends and cultural memories of the peoples who had taken the Hittites' place. The process was not dramatic. It was quiet, gradual, and complete, and it happened to one of the most powerful and well-documented civilizations in the ancient world. Then something happened that changed everything. Not in the ancient world, but in our understanding of what the Bronze Age collapse means for the world we are building right now. The discovery and decipherment of the Hattusa archive gave us something we had never had before: a detailed, first-person account of a great civilization's functioning in the decades before its destruction. The Hittite tablets are not just relics of a dead culture, they are a warning, preserved in clay, from a world that was too interconnected to fail, and that failed anyway. They show us, with uncomfortable clarity, that complexity is not strength, that prosperity is not permanence, that the systems we build to sustain our way of life can become the instruments of its destruction when the conditions that sustained those systems change. The Hittites built a world of extraordinary sophistication, ambition, and achievement, and they lost it all, not to a superior enemy, not to their own moral failings, but to a combination of environmental change, systemic fragility, and cascading failure that no one anticipated, no one fully understood, and no one could stop once it had begun. What does the story of Hattusa and the broader story of the Bronze Age collapse mean for us? Not as an exercise in historical curiosity, but as a living, breathing lesson about the world we have built and the risks we face. The first and most obvious implication is about the fragility of interconnected systems. The Bronze Age world was, relative to its time, extraordinarily interconnected. Trade routes spanned thousands of kilometers. Diplomatic relationships linked kingdoms on different continents. Specialized production centers supplied goods to distant markets. The wealth and complexity of the great powers depended on the smooth functioning of this network. And when the network failed, the powers failed with it. Not one by one, in isolation, but all at once, in a cascading collapse that swept across the entire Eastern Mediterranean within a single generation. Our world is incomparably more interconnected than the Bronze Age world ever was. Our trade routes span the globe. Our financial systems link every major economy through a web of debt, credit, and investment that operates at the speed of light. Our communication networks carry more information in a single second than the entire Bronze Age diplomatic corps exchanged in a century. Our supply chains are so extended, so specialized, and so tightly optimized for efficiency that they have very little redundancy built into them. A semiconductor factory in one country can be the sole source of a critical component used in the products of 100 industries in 100 other countries. A single shipping bottleneck can disrupt supply chains that stretch across multiple continents. A cyber attack on a single pipeline can cause fuel shortages across an entire region. A disruption at that single factory, that single port, that single pipeline can ripple through the global economy, affecting production, employment, and economic growth thousands of kilometers away. We are, in the language of systems theory, tightly coupled on a scale that the Bronze Age world could never have achieved. The Bronze Age powers did not understand the risks of their interconnection. They did not have a concept of systemic risk. The idea that a complex network can be brought down by the failure of components that seem individually manageable. They did not plan for the possibility that their trade routes might be permanently disrupted, that their grain supplies might fail for years at a time, that their military alliances might prove inadequate against a novel form of threat. They assumed, as we tend to assume, that the systems they had built would continue to function because they had always functioned before. The letters from the kings of Ugarit and Hatti, in their final years, reveal no awareness that they were living through the end of their world. They mention enemies and grain shortages and military deployments, but always in the tone of people dealing with temporary problems, difficulties that would eventually be resolved, crises that would eventually pass. They did not know that the crises would not pass. They did not know that the systems they depended on were not experiencing a temporary disruption, but a permanent collapse. We are in a different position. We have the benefit of hindsight. We know what happened to the Bronze Age world. We can study the mechanisms of its collapse. We can identify the vulnerabilities of our own systems and take steps to address them. But knowledge is not the same as action, and awareness is not the same as preparation. We know that our infrastructure is aging, that bridges and dams and water systems built in the mid-20th century are approaching or exceeding their designed lifespans. We know that our supply chains are fragile, optimized for efficiency at the expense of redundancy, vulnerable to disruption at critical choke points. We know that our climate is changing in ways that will stress agricultural systems, water supplies, and coastal infrastructure. We know that our digital preservation systems are inadequate, that vast quantities of information are being lost to format obsolescence, media degradation, and institutional neglect. We know these things, and yet the pace of action to address them is in many cases far slower than the pace of the risks themselves. The Hittite example offers one more lesson that is worth emphasizing. The Hittite Empire did not collapse because it was poorly governed or because its people were lacking in intelligence, skill, or determination. By every available measure, the Hittites were among the most capable administrators, diplomats, and military strategists of the ancient world. Their legal system was sophisticated, their diplomacy was subtle, their military organization was formidable. They had managed a multi-ethnic, multilingual empire for centuries, with a degree of success that few ancient states could match. And yet they fell. They fell because the conditions that sustained their empire changed, and they could not change fast enough to adapt. The lesson is not that competence protects against collapse. The lesson is that even the most competent society can be overwhelmed by forces that operate at a scale and a speed that exceed its capacity to respond. There is a philosophical dimension to the Hattusa story that deserves reflection. The Hittites built something extraordinary. They created an empire that was in many ways remarkably humane by the standards of its time. Their legal system emphasized restitution over punishment, seeking to repair harm rather than inflict suffering. Their religious practice embraced the gods of conquered peoples rather than suppressing them, recognizing that cultural diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness. Their diplomatic tradition sought peaceful resolution of conflicts when possible, as demonstrated by the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty, one of the great achievements of ancient statecraft. They were not a perfect society. No ancient society was. Slavery existed. Warfare was frequent. The king held absolute power, but within the constraints of their time, they represented a genuine achievement of human organization, governance, and cross-cultural accommodation. They showed that an empire could be held together not only by force but by law, by diplomacy, and by respect for the traditions of the diverse peoples within it. And all of it was lost. Not because it was unworthy of preservation, not because a superior civilization replaced it, not because the Hittite people themselves were deficient in some way. It was lost because the environmental and geopolitical conditions that had sustained it changed faster than the institutions could adapt. The drought came, the trade routes closed, the vassals rebelled, the enemies attacked, and the empire, stretched too thin across too much territory, fighting on too many fronts, unable to feed its capital, unable to maintain its military, unable to hold its fractious coalition of peoples and provinces together, collapsed. The speed of the collapse is itself worthy of contemplation. The Hittite Empire at its height, around 1250 before the Common Era, was one of the most powerful states on earth, capable of fielding armies of tens of thousands, administering territories stretching across 1 million square kilometers, and conducting diplomacy with every major civilization in the known world. Within 50 years it was gone. Within a century, its cities were ruins. Within a few centuries, its very existence was forgotten. That transition from superpower to oblivion happened within the span of 2 or 3 human lifetimes. A person born in Hattusa at the height of the empire, around 1250 before the Common Era, who lived to old age, could have lived to see the beginning of the collapse. Their grandchildren could have been among the last to leave the dying city. Their great-grandchildren might have been illiterate farmers in a small village, with no knowledge that their ancestors had been citizens of a great empire, administrators of a vast bureaucratic state, readers and writers of a literary and legal tradition spanning centuries. The speed with which a complex civilization can disintegrate, shedding its institutions, its technologies, its knowledge, and its identity in the space of a few generations, is one of the most unsettling and most important lessons that history has to teach. The loss was not just political. It was cultural, intellectual, and spiritual. The religious traditions of 1,000 gods were dispersed and eventually forgotten. The legal principles that had governed the lives of millions were abandoned. The diplomatic practices that had maintained peace between great powers were discarded. The scribal traditions that had recorded, preserved, and transmitted knowledge for centuries ceased to operate. The Hittite language itself gradually disappeared from use, replaced by Luwian and eventually by the languages of the peoples who moved into the power vacuum left by the empire's collapse. Within a few centuries, the Hittites had been forgotten as completely as if they had never existed. Their massive stone walls were scavenged for building material. Their carved lions were buried by centuries of accumulated earth. Their tablets lay in the dirt unread until Hugo Winkler came along with a shovel and a sense of wonder. We carry our own knowledge. We build our own institutions. We maintain our own networks of trade and communication and mutual dependence. And we assume, as the Hittites must have assumed, that these things will endure, that our children will inherit what we have built, that the systems we depend on will continue to function long into the future, that the knowledge we have accumulated will be preserved and transmitted to future generations without interruption. But the Hittite precedent suggests that this assumption is a luxury, not a guarantee. It must be earned, continuously, through the active maintenance of the institutions, the infrastructure, and the educational traditions that carry knowledge forward through time. When that maintenance lapses, when funding is cut, when institutions are neglected, when the effort of transmission is deferred or reduced, the knowledge begins to slip away, slowly at first, then faster, then irreversibly, and once it is gone, it may be gone forever. The Hittites learned this lesson. They did not choose to learn it. It was inflicted on them by circumstances they could not control. We have the opportunity to learn it from their example, without having to suffer the same fate. Whether we take that opportunity is the question that the ruins of Hattusa, silent on their hilltop for 3,000 years, continue to pose. The Bronze Age collapse is sometimes described as the worst disaster in ancient history. That assessment may be correct. In terms of the number of civilizations destroyed, the extent of territory affected, the volume of knowledge lost, and the duration of the subsequent Dark Age, it has few rivals in the historical record. But the more important point is not how bad it was, but how relevant it remains. The mechanisms that brought down the Bronze Age world, environmental change, trade disruption, political instability, cascading systemic failure, demographic pressure, and the inability of institutions to adapt quickly enough to changing conditions are not ancient curiosities confined to dusty textbooks. They are universal. They are operating today in different forms, in different places, with different specifics, but with the same underlying dynamics. The question is not whether we are vulnerable. We are. The question is whether we are wise enough to see the vulnerability and act on it before the cables begin to snap. The Hittites could not see what was coming. We have the advantage of their example, preserved in 30,000 clay tablets, and the ruins of a city that no one remembered for 3,000 years. Whether we use that advantage is up to us. There is one more thing the Hittites can teach us. Their civilization was not brought down by a lack of intelligence or a lack of effort. They were brilliant administrators, skilled diplomats, capable warriors, and talented artists. They did everything right, within the limits of their understanding and their technology, and they still fell. The lesson is not that we should try to do better than the Hittites. The lesson is that doing everything right may not be enough if the conditions we depend on change in ways we cannot control and cannot foresee. The Hittites could not make the rains return to the Anatolian plateau. They could not make the tin caravans resume their journeys along disrupted trade routes. They could not prevent the sea peoples from migrating. They could only respond to events that were larger than any single kingdom's capacity to manage. We face our own set of conditions that are changing in ways that may exceed our capacity to manage. The question is whether we will recognize this truth in time to build the resilience, the redundancy, and the institutional depth that the Hittites, for all their brilliance, did not have. There is a hilltop in central Turkey, roughly 150 kilometers east of Ankara, where the grass grows thin over the remains of massive stone walls. The hilltop is called Bogazkale today, though it was once called Bogazkoy, and before that, for centuries, it had no name at all, because the people who had built the walls, and the temples, and the palaces within them had been forgotten so completely that even the place itself had lost its identity. Beneath the grass and the rubble lie the remains of Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. The walls still trace the outline of the city's vast perimeter, stretching for over 6 kilometers across the ridges and valleys of the Anatolian plateau. The foundations of more than 30 temples are still visible in the upper city, their ground plans marking out the precincts where 1,000 gods were once honored with festivals and sacrifices and songs. The Lion Gate still stands, its carved guardians snarling into the emptiness, defending a city that no one has entered as a citizen for over 3,000 years. The postern tunnel still runs beneath the fortification wall, its corbelled arches intact, a passageway leading from the inside of a dead city to the outside of a world that has moved on without it. In the museums of Ankara and Istanbul, the tablets from the Hattusa archive are stored in climate-controlled rooms, catalogued and numbered, studied by scholars who have spent their careers learning to read a language that was unknown to the modern world until the early 20th century. These tablets are the voices of the Hittite Empire. They speak of kings and gods, of wars and treaties, of festivals and laws, of horses and chariots, of grain and gold, and the endless, intricate business of governing a vast, multi-ethnic, multilingual empire in a world of rival powers and shifting alliances. They are the only voices we have, the only words that survived the destruction of the city, the collapse of the empire, the 3,000-year silence that followed. 30,000 Dwen tablets. 30,000 messages from a civilization that was, until a century ago, forgotten. 30,000 fragments of a world that once stretched from the Aegean to the Euphrates, that traded with Egypt and Babylon and Mycenae, that signed treaties and arranged marriages and waged wars and worshipped 1,000 gods and trained horses and adjudicated disputes and wrote prayers to deities whose names had not been spoken for 3 millennia. 30,000 pieces of a puzzle that, even when assembled with painstaking care by generations of scholars, shows us only a fraction of what was lost. How many more tablets were taken when the court fled? How many were destroyed in the fires? How many peripheral archives were lost entirely, at regional capitals and vassal courts whose names we may never know? The archive we have is a marvel, a treasure, a window into a vanished world, and it is, almost certainly, a tiny remnant of what once existed. The decipherment of the Hittite tablets is itself a story of human persistence and intellectual courage. When Winkler first unearthed the archive, the language of the tablets was entirely unknown. It took years of painstaking work by scholars including Bedřich Hrozný, whose breakthrough came in 1915 when he realized that the Hittite language was Indo-European, to begin reading the texts. The decipherment process continued for decades, and new texts are still being published and translated today, more than a century after the initial discovery. Each new text is a recovered voice, a message brought back from the silence. Each translation is an act of resurrection, restoring meaning to marks that have been mute for over 3,000 years. The scholars who do this work are, in a very real sense, the opposite of the forces of forgetting. They are fighting to reverse the erasure, one tablet at a time. The Hittite Empire was not a minor kingdom or a marginal culture. It was one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, a peer of Egypt and Babylon, a power that shaped the history of the Near East for centuries. Its diplomatic practices laid the groundwork for the tradition of international law that we follow, however imperfectly, today. Its legal principles, emphasizing restitution and reconciliation, resonate with modern approaches to justice. Its religious tolerance, its willingness to embrace the gods of other peoples, speaks to a capacity for cross-cultural accommodation that many modern societies still struggle to achieve. The Hittites were not primitives. They were not savages. They were sophisticated, literate, creative people who built a civilization of genuine achievement, and they were forgotten. The forgetting is the real story, not the destruction of the city, which was violent but not unique, not the collapse of the empire, which was dramatic but not unprecedented. The forgetting, the utter, complete, 3,000-year oblivion that swallowed one of the great civilizations of the ancient world and left behind nothing but a few enigmatic references in the Bible and some puzzling mentions in Egyptian inscriptions. The Hittites did not fade gradually from memory, like Rome, which declined over centuries and was never entirely forgotten. They vanished. One generation they were a superpower. The next, they were gone. Within a few centuries, no one knew they had existed. Within a few millennia, scholars debated whether the Hittites of the Bible were even real. This is what time can do. This is what forgetting looks like. Not a dramatic act of suppression or censorship, but a quiet, gradual, complete dissolution of memory, like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples across the surface for a moment, and then sinking into the darkness, leaving the water smooth and still, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. We build our own cities, we write our own archives, we sign our own treaties, and maintain our own alliances and worship, in our own ways, our own gods. We believe, as the Hittites must have believed, that our works will endure, that our names will be remembered, that the things we have built and known and cherished will be carried forward by our children and their children after them, stretching into a future that we cannot see, but that we trust will be there. Perhaps it will. Perhaps the modern world, with its redundant communication systems, its distributed archives, its global networks of knowledge preservation and transmission, has built something durable enough to survive the kinds of disruptions that destroyed the Bronze Age world. Perhaps our civilization will be the one that breaks the pattern, that maintains its chain of knowledge unbroken across the centuries and the millennia to come. Or perhaps, somewhere in the distant future, an archaeologist will climb a grass-covered hill in a landscape that has lost its name. They will dig through layers of accumulated earth and rubble. They will find the remains of walls and foundations, the skeleton of a city that no one remembers. They will recover fragments, pieces of a vanished world, messages in a language no one speaks, artifacts from a culture no one knows. They will study these fragments and marvel at what they reveal. And they will wonder, as we wonder about the Hittites, how a civilization so vast, so sophisticated, so rich in knowledge and achievement could have been so completely forgotten. The Lion Gate at Hattusa still stands. Its stone guardians still snarl into the wind that blows across the Anatolian plateau. Cold in winter, dry in summer, ceaseless across the empty hilltop where a great city once stood and where tens of thousands of people once lived, worked, worshipped, traded, argued, loved, and died. The lions were carved to protect the city from enemies. They could not protect it from drought. They could not protect it from the failure of the trade routes. They could not protect it from the slow erosion of the institutional systems that had sustained the city for centuries. They could not protect it from time. They could not protect it from forgetting. They stand now as monuments not to the power of the Hittite Empire but to the fragility of human memory, the ease with which the greatest achievements of a civilization can be swallowed by silence and lost to the ages, and the quiet courage of the archaeologists, linguists, and historians who have spent the past century pulling those achievements back from the void. A Bronze Age Megacity, an empire of millions, 1,000 gods honoured in more than 30 temples, 30,000 tablets preserving the voices of kings and scribes and diplomats and priests, 3,000 years of oblivion, during which all of this was forgotten so completely that the modern world had to dig it out of the earth to learn it had ever existed. The lions still stand guard, but the city they were built to protect is empty. The empire they symbolized is dust. The civilizations they represented has been silent for 3,000 years, and there is no one left to protect, and the wind blows on.